In the year 793, something happened off the coast of Northumbria that sent shockwaves across Christian Europe. Monks at Lindisfarne, one of the holiest sites in Anglo-Saxon England, looked to the sea and saw longships approaching. What followed was fire, bloodshed and panic. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it simply as "Heathen men miserably destroyed God's church with plunder and slaughter." This is the first in a 4-part series about the Viking attacks on England, where we see the raids growing in frequency, ferocity and size over a 70-year period, before the full-scale invasion by the Great Heathen Army in 865, which was to bring Anglo-Saxon England to its knees. The England that the Vikings attacked was not the unified country that we recognise today. Instead, it was a series of competing kingdoms. As Anglo-Saxon migrants had arrived from northwestern Europe in the 5th century after Britain had been abandoned by the Roman Empire, they formed into small communities, which grew then into clans and tribes. And over time, these tribes coalesced into a series of kingdoms. For the next 350 years, they fought each other and their British neighbours to the west in modern-day Wales and Cornwall, and to the north in what would eventually become Scotland. Kingdoms rose and fell, and at various stages one kingdom might become the dominant power, but receiving tribute from the other kings rather than creating a unified England. And just for the record, both Scotland and Wales were also a series of competing kingdoms at this time in history too. By the late 8th century, these competing power blocks had been whittled down to 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria in the northeast of what is now England, dropping down into Yorkshire, East Anglia, Mercia in the middle, and Wessex in the south. The period leading into that fateful year of 793 had been dominated by the Midland Kingdom of Mercia under their greatest king, Offa. However, with Offa's death in 796, Mercian power started to be eclipsed by the southern kingdom of Wessex under their king, Ecgberht. But that wasn't the only change happening to the land of the Angles and Saxons. In 793, the Anglo-Saxon world would be shaken to its core by raiders from across the sea, the Vikings. The monastery on the island of Lindisfarne had been founded by St Aidan in 634. The Irish monk from the monastery at Iona off the west coast of Scotland is credited with converting the Northumbrian king, Oswald, to Christianity. Now, this is the Oswald who I referred to in my episode about Penda, the pagan king of Mercia. And if you recall, Oswald was defeated by Penda. Anyway, for the next 160 years, the remote monastery off the Northumbrian coast became a centre of learning with the illuminated manuscripts such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, prayer and pilgrimage, with pilgrims visiting the shrine of St Cuthbert. And then on the 8th of June, 793, the monks at Lindisfarne came face to face with hell. A fleet of Viking raiders landed and attacked their monastery. During the attack, many of the monks were killed or carried off into slavery. The library was ransacked and the monastery looted of its treasures. The raid on Lindisfarne is often seen as the beginning of the Viking raids on England. But actually, it wasn't the first. 4 years earlier, in 789, a group of Vikings had landed at Portland in Dorset, down in the southern kingdom of Wessex. They were met by the king's local representative, the Reeve. Now, it's from these Reeves of the Shires, or Shire Reeves, that we get the modern word, sheriff. Anyway, the Vikings promptly killed him, so I guess the king needed a new sheriff in town. Couldn't resist that one. But the attack on Lindisfarne shocked the whole of Christian England. After all, it was an attack on a religious site by these Vikings. Now, the term Viking is a later invention that's sort of used as a catch-all phrase to describe any raiders coming from Scandinavia. At the time, they were actually referred to as Northmen, Norse, Danes, or heathens. In fact, the word Viking itself in the Old Norse means pirate or raider. In other words, far from being a unified people, the Vikings consisted of men from countless small settlements across Scandinavia, heading over the North Sea to enrich themselves with stolen loot. Whilst they were pagans, or heathens as the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called them, and seemed to enjoy attacking Christian places of worship, they were not, or certainly not in most cases, on a mission to wipe out Christians or Christianity. Remember, they were pirates, raiders, and just like sort of muggers in our current age, they looked for soft targets. And the Christian monasteries, located in remote places for spiritual contemplation and full of gold and silver crosses and plates and cups and other offerings, were just too good an opportunity to miss. And just for good measure, they were occupied by people who didn't know how to fight back. In fact, they could be taken off as slaves, which was another way of enriching these pirates. And if Brother Osbert was daft enough to try and stop a Viking taking the gold cross off the altar, well, more fool him. So, with that in mind, it might not come as a shock to find out that the following year, after Lindisfarne, they then sailed up the Tyne and raided the monastery at Jarrow, the home of the by then deceased Venerable Bede. A year after that, the monastery at Iona off the west coast of Scotland, one time home of Lindisfarne founder Aidan, was plundered. Then in 802 the Scottish monastery was raided again, and then 4 years later too, when 68 monks were killed. By the time Viking raiders returned for a fourth time, they found the monks had packed their bags and relocated to Ireland, and there they founded the monastery at Kells, 20 whole miles inland from the sea. As the 800s progressed, raids by the Scandinavians increased in frequency. They also widened their scope, because if you just read histories of England, then you might be under the impression that England was the Vikings' prime target. But the reality was, because they were raiders, they would go wherever they could find some loot, and they were highly active along the coastline of Francia, modern-day France too. The small Viking fleets were also starting to work together as well. In 845, a fleet of over 100 ships, led by a warrior named Ragnar, who may or may not have been the legendary saga character Ragnar Lodbrok, sailed over 100 miles up the River Seine and attacked Paris itself. And as we've already seen from the Viking attacks on Iona, the Vikings were also raiding around the coast of Scotland, which is actually a reasonably short crossing for Norse pirates coming from Norway. And as the 9th century wore on, they became more active in Ireland too. By the early 840s, they had established a centre of operations on the River Liffey at Dublin. And that base at Dublin didn't simply increase their raids around Ireland. It now made raids on the kingdoms in Wales and southwest England easier too. In fact, just a few years beforehand, in 836, a fleet of 35 ships had landed in North Somerset. Whilst not as large as the fleet that had attacked Paris, this was a powerful raiding party. In 1904, a well-preserved Viking ship was excavated at a burial mound at Osberg in Norway. Carbon dating placed the burial mound at 834, in other words, the period we're talking about. The ship has 15 pairs of oar holes, indicating a rowing crew of 30. So, if we assume that the ships landing in Somerset were of a similar Norse design, and then extrapolate that figure of 35 ships times 30 rowers, we have a raiding party of around 1,000 men. The simple raiding parties, like the one which had had that run-in with the Shire Reef at Portland, had started to resemble an army in numbers. Earlier I said that the Vikings were akin to modern-day muggers, looking for easy victims. So if we keep with that analogy, it's now like we have 1,000 muggers operating together. Now, in modern terms, you can imagine how police forces would be under considerable strain dealing with that number. Maybe even the army might even have to be called in to counter the threat. And so it was back in the 9th century. Where once a village or a local noble had been able to put up a fight, it now required a larger armed response from the state. And thus the King of Wessex himself, King Ecgberht, led his army to Somerset. At the subsequent Battle of Carhampton, his army was defeated. And whilst Ecgberht survived, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us the slaughter on both sides was great. 2 years later, the Vikings landed in Cornwall, which was an independent Brythonic kingdom at that time. and despite being Christians, the Cornish, or the West Welsh as the Anglo-Saxons actually called them, made common cause with the heathen Vikings and attacked Wessex. Once more, King Ecgberht raised his army, and this time he was the victor, defeating the Cornish and their Viking allies at the Battle of Higston Down. Ecgberht was now well into his 60s, which is pretty impressive in those times, and had ruled Wessex for over 30 years. What with another attack on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent back in 835, Wessex had faced significant Viking attacks 3 times in 4 years. But those attacks were still smash and grab raids. Nevertheless, their frequency and the size of those raiding parties were a concern to Ecgberht. And remember what I said earlier, despite the ferocious reputation that they enjoyed both then and later on, the Vikings were always looking for easy pickings. They would fight if they had to, but if they could find an easy, undefended, weak target, they would head for it. And whilst lone monasteries fell into that category, so too did weak states that were unable to defend those monasteries or other settlements. Ecgberht looked across the Channel at the Frankish Empire, which was riven by internal divisions. With the state unable to put up a strong defence and in some cases rival factions employing the Scandinavians to fight on their particular disputes, the Vikings ran amok in Francia. After 30 years defending his kingdom against his northern neighbour, Mercia, as well as the Viking raiders, and the Cornish, Ecgberht was determined to leave a strong, united kingdom, unlike what he could see at Francia across the Channel. To do so, in 838, he had his son, Aethelwulf, consecrated as the next king. There would be no disputed succession and internal rifts in his kingdom when he was gone. And the following year, the old king died, and Aethelwulf duly came to the throne, unopposed. There might be a new king of Wessex, but for the Vikings, it was business as usual. The following year, a fleet consisting of 33 Viking ships, so again probably about 1,000 warriors, attacked the main trading port of Wessex at Hamwich, modern-day Southampton. They were, however, seen off by a determined attack by the local ealdormen of Hampshire. That same year, 840, Portland in Dorset, where the very first attack on the Shire Reeve had occurred over 50 years beforehand, was raided again. This time it was the local forces under the ealdormen of Dorset who were on the losing sides, with their commander killed in the process. Just 12 months later, the ealdorman of Kent was defeated and killed, confronting raiders at Romney Marshes. That year, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, in just one line, that there were also attacks in what is now North Lincolnshire, but at the time was Lindsey in the Kingdom of Mercia, and also in the Kingdom of East Anglia. These attacks were getting more and more frequent. In 842, it was the turn of the trading port of Londonwich to receive a visit from the Vikings. This settlement, which was the key trading town of Mercia, had been built next to the old Roman city of Londinium, which was now an abandoned ghost of a previous time in British history. The new trading centre, or Witch, was centred around what is now the Strand in central London. Unlike the derelict Roman city, this settlement had no walls to protect it. The Chronicle records a great slaughter amongst its inhabitants. Maybe not surprisingly, those who did survive decided to relocate back into the old Roman city, and the famous square mile of London once more became a thriving commercial centre, and it's never stopped since. 843, a new year, and yet another raid. This time it was the north coast of Somerset again. King Aethelwulf had had enough and marched with his army against the Vikings. And just like his father, he met them in battle at Carhampton. Surely lightning couldn't strike twice. Well, actually in Aethelwulf's case, obviously it did, because he lost again. The Vikings, however, weren't so lucky next time they raided the county. Landing at the mouth of the River Parrett, which is sort of somewhere between modern-day Burnham-on-Sea and Bridgewater in 845, they found themselves confronted by the combined armies of Somerset and Dorset, led by their respective ealdormen, and they were heavily defeated. With that victory, King Aethelwulf and the army of Wessex now started a winning streak against the raiders. In 850, whilst the Ealdorman of Devon was defeating a Viking incursion, once more in Somerset, the king himself attacked a raiding fleet at Sandwich in Kent, capturing 9 ships. Later that same year, a giant raiding fleet consisting of 350 ships sailed up the Thames, attacking Canterbury before defeating the King of Mercia outside London. The victorious Vikings then crossed onto the south bank of the Thames and raided into Surrey, part of Aethelwulf's domain. The king swiftly gathered his army, and in a battle at a place called Acklea or Oakfield, he achieved a great victory. Historians have never been able to identify the location of the battle, but both Ockley near Dorking and Oakley just to the west of Basingstoke are contenders. Wherever it was, Alfred the Great's biographer, Asa, Bishop of Sherborne, claimed that the victory was so emphatic that people were still talking about it 40 years later on, when he, Asa, was writing about Aethelwulf's son. Which, considering the events that took place in the intervening 40 years, must have made it a significant victory. Maybe it was pure coincidence, but Wessex now entered into a period of relative peace. Apart from the Ealdormen of Kent and Surrey combining to defeat Vikings on the Isle of Thanet in 853, there were no reported raids in the kingdom for over a decade. Aethelwulf must have felt his kingdom was secure enough because in 853, the year of that defeated raid in Thanet, the king decided to travel to Rome on pilgrimage. Heading off with his wife, he left his kingdom to be temporarily ruled by 2 of his sons. As his eldest son had died a couple of years previously, the king placed his second son, Aethelbald, in charge of the west of the kingdom, the old historic heartlands of Wessex. The next son, Aethelbert, was designated to look after the eastern portion consisting of Kent, Surrey and Sussex. The king would be gone for the best part of a year. He was also accompanied by the youngest of his 5 sons, Alfred. Alfred, who would have been about 5 at this time, was supposedly blessed on this visit by the Pope. I say supposedly because the only account that we have either of Alfred's presence in Rome or the papal blessing comes from his biographer, Asa, the Bishop of Sherborne. Asa's Life of King Alfred would be what we would nowadays call an authorised biography. The tributes that Asa pays to Alfred throughout the work are just gushing and certainly build Alfred up to be better than any of his brothers, and despite being brother number 5, the one who is destined to be king and earn the title the Great. What better way of placing Alfred in pole position than to have a papal blessing? It would also cement Alfred and his descendants' claim to the throne of Wessex against their rivals. And there were rivals. But that will be for an episode coming soon. So, a great story, but as to whether it's a historical fact, well, you take your pick. What we do know is that whilst in Rome, Alfred's mother, the Lady Osburh, died, and on the return journey, whilst passing through Francia, widower King Aethelwulf married the daughter of Charles the Bald. Now, the King of Wessex marrying the daughter of the King of Francia so soon after his wife's death didn't actually raise many eyebrows. What did was that the 50-year-old king's bride, Judith, was just 12 at the time. At her father's urging, Aethelwulf broke with Wessex custom and made her a queen rather than a mere lady, and breaking that tradition raised some conservative eyebrows back home too. So whether it was in response to Aethelwulf's midlife crisis or whether the wheels were already in motion, but the son he'd left in charge of Wessex, Aethelbald, now rebelled and refused to give up his temporary stewardship of his father's kingdom, or at least the western part anyway. Aethelwulf agreed to allow his son to remain in charge of the old Wessex heartlands, whilst he returned to directly rule the eastern areas of Kent, Sussex and Surrey, although, in fairness, he probably didn't have a choice in it. In 858, following a 19-year reign, Aethelwulf died, and he was succeeded to the eastern part of his kingdom by son number 3, Aethelbert, the son who had ruled the area whilst his father was in Rome. Meanwhile, Aethelbald remained in control of the west. He also took a new wife, his father's widow, the 14-year-old Queen Judith. The couple hadn't had any children when, just 2 years later, he died in 860. Now his brother, Aethelbert, succeeded to the old Heartlands, and Wessex was once more reunited into a single kingdom. Judith, now aged 16, was a widow for the second time. Within 18 months, she had eloped with Baldwin, Count of Flanders. Also known as Iron Arm, he had been appointed by Charles the Bald, her father, to the coastal regions of what is now Belgium to repel Viking raiders who were still attacking his coastline. Marrying for the third time, and on this occasion without her father's consent, the couple would actually have 3 sons and possibly 2 daughters. And through the second of those sons, their direct descendant, Matilda of Flanders, would marry one William of Normandy. But that story, as they say, is for another day. The ascension of Aethelbert to the throne in 860 also coincided with renewed Viking activity along the coastline of southern England. That very year, the Ealdormen of Berkshire had fought off a Viking attack near Winchester. And then at the end of 864, a large Viking raiding party occupied the Isle of Thanet. Now a geographical term for the area at the very eastern tip of Kent, where the towns of Ramsgate and Margate are located. It was genuinely an island at this time, separated from the mainland by a channel which in places is over 500 metres wide. The channel finally silted up in the late 17th century, joining the Isle of Thanet to the rest of Kent. The isle had been subjected to numerous Viking attacks, where its monasteries had been easy prey. Now, having agreed to accept a bribe, which would later be called a Danegeld, from the locals not to attack them, the raiders went back on their word and plundered eastern Kent anyway. But that was the least of Aethelbert's problems, because this occupation at the end of 864 was different. This time, for the very first time, the Vikings didn't go home for winter. They hunkered down on the Isle of Thanet, ready for a spring raiding season in southern England. And thus in itself must have worried the Anglo-Saxons. But what those Vikings heralded was far worse. When spring came, they would be joined by a huge fleet containing seasoned fighters from Francia and further afield. Led by the sons of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lodbrok, they were not merely interested in plunder anymore. Now they had a new agenda: conquest. And Anglo-Saxon England would never be the same again. So, join me next time as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are brought to their knees by a full-scale invasion by the Great Heathen Army. In the meantime, thanks for joining me today, and a particular thanks to my supporters and patrons. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.